Yep, we're good to go.
All right, Madam Chair, you have 4 of your 5 county commissioners.
All righty then. Welcome back to the afternoon segment of our work session for Tuesday, January 19th, 2021. And the first topic on our afternoon agenda is the Public Health Advisory Council membership with Tricia Mortel, our Public Health Division Manager. Hello, Tricia.
Good afternoon, Chair Harrington, Commissioners. Thank you for your time this afternoon. So I'm here with something non-COVID, that's always nice. Although it's related to COVID because this is an instrumental advisory council put together by your board that has been weighing in on a variety of things related to COVID and sharing their thoughts and knowledge with us as we move through this pandemic and to the light at the end of the tunnel as Commissioner Fye mentioned. So the recruitment this time was not as successful as we have been in the past, but we do understand that many people are really overtaxed and overwhelmed with the changes in their lives. So we, for Commissioner Fye in particular, we did a large overhaul of our Public Health Advisory Council membership last year. We previously had sector members and we opened it to be non-sector related with a focus on a diverse council. And so we've been very fortunate to have recruited diversity among our council participants over the past year. But going into this new recruitment, we received only 2 applicants and 1 dropped out before the final process. So we have 3 openings for new positions. And only Julie Scott finalized her application with us. Scotland, excuse me. Julie describes herself as a new mom, ally for BIPOC and LGBTQ communities, an outdoor enthusiast and a business professional. She lives in District 2 and works as a marketing consultant. She wants to join the Public Health Advisory Council to help build a happier, healthier, and more informed community so her daughter and every other child in Washington County can grow up in a safe and supportive environment where they can thrive. Additionally, we are recommending 2 reappointments. Both of these women served for only 1 year as they came into a midterm appointment. Generally, appointments are for 4 years. Jennifer McElvery, I'm not saying it right, I know that, has served on the council over the past years. She is the pharmacy operations manager at Virginia Garcia Memorial Health Center. She's worked there since 2007, and she joined the council to serve her community by utilizing her knowledge and skills to impact community health in Washington County. And Anne Marie Paulson, again, has only served for 1 year. She, shortly after joining the council, she actually stepped up into the chair role, which is amazing. She works as a primary care physician and has been practicing for the past 8 years. She originally joined the Public Health Council Advisory Council to expand her contributions to the community beyond her work as a physician. We're also, you'll notice in our presentation, we want to publicly thank Larry Boxman with Metro West Ambulance. Larry sat on the council since the inception of this new council, shortly before I came to Washington County, I think 6 years ago. So he has served out all of his terms. Karen Reynolds also is leaving our council. She served in 1 term and has been very instrumental in supporting conversations, and particularly I think she's from Forest Grove, so our that side of the county has been very well represented. So our recommendation is appointment of Julie Scotland as a new member and our 2 returning members to be reappointed.
So commissioners, any questions or comments for Tricia? If I might, go ahead, Commissioner Treese.
I serve on the FAC, and I just want to say what a great job Tricia does in organizing the team, but also the leadership of your department does a great job in providing programs and interesting opportunities for input for the committee. So thank you.
Tricia, I don't have any question on these applicants. But I have an informational curiosity question. As 3 of us have been on the Board of Commissioners for a couple of years now, we've had the opportunity to learn from you and your team about the measles epidemic that was occurring in 2019, efforts to continue to address tuberculosis and other communicable diseases, in addition to behavioral health needs. And then, of course, the overwhelming pandemic of them all, COVID. I was wondering if you might, just off the top of your head, give us a feel for what are some of the most challenging or interesting topics that this advisory council has grappled with during that time.
Well, so this council also serves as the Public Health Ethics Committee, and we've done a few ethics deliberations. Mostly they were theoretical, but in this last year, we actually convened them to talk about if scarce resources occurred in terms of ventilators in the hospital, what was an ethical way that we would make decisions in our community? So very heady conversation, very hard conversation. They certainly have had lots of input into our COVID response, and in particular, equity in terms of how we're reaching communities most impacted. I think that that's overshadowed probably everything that we've done in the past, but they do provide, as you know, recommendations directly to you and supportive, for example, of your guidance around tobacco retail licensure, which we almost started right before COVID happened. As a local, they provided input into the and now I'm forgetting what we would call it, but drug take back ordinance, again, that you all were successful in terms of passing prior to the state. So they weigh in on every important conversation from a policy level all the way down to a program level. If we really want our program folks to come in and ask them something specific about program delivery, they engage in that as well.
Thank you very much. It really brings to life what the work of the advisory committee is. And sometimes our descriptions on websites don't give the sense of the richness of conversation and how it really does bring the opportunity for voices in our community to talk about how things are going, how we might approach things differently. So thank you. Thank you very much.
And I will say, I think that every one of our applicants or our members always been very appreciative of the opportunity to be on a board appointed council, appointed to help us, but to help you too.
Cool, great. Well, unless there are any further questions or comments, I expect that we will have this come to us as an action within the next couple of weeks.
Perfect. Thank you again for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, Tricia. Keep up the great work.
Okay.
Next, we'll move on to something completely different and not in the public health domain, and that is transportation. So I'll turn it over to Stephen Roberts and his crew to talk about the potential MSTIP Major Streets Transportation Improvement Program bonding cost sharing program project list amendment. Boom, boom. Take it away, Stephen.
That was a mouthful. Thank you, Chair. I also have Joe Yonkins, who's our Capital Projects Services Manager, on the line with me as well, in case you have questions, but I'll sort of walk us through the presentation. We also have Don Odermatt with the City of Hillsborough, should be listening in and might be available to help address questions if you have them as well. So again, thanks for having us come in front of you today. As the chair mentioned, we are wanting to brief you on a potential amendment to the project list that was adopted as a part of this MSTIP bonding cost sharing program back in 2015. So I'll walk us through just a little bit of history. Next, please. So as I mentioned, the program itself was adopted by the board in June 2015. And in a previous discussion with the chair, she reminded me that 4 of the current commissioners weren't on the board at the time. So it's a good idea to just step back a little bit and talk briefly about the program's intent and how it was structured. The idea here was to create a revenue stream by bonding some future MSTIP revenues to create essentially a separate funding stream that would help accelerate some improvements to county roads that were in and adjacent to some high growth areas, UGB expansions that occurred back in 2011-ish. And those 4 are listed there: North Bethany, Bonnie Slope West, River Terrace in the Tigard area, South Cooper Mountain in Beaverton, South Hillsborough in the city of Hillsborough. Just as importantly as creating that new revenue stream was really the intent to preserve a fixed revenue stream of $35 million per year in the traditional MSTIP pay-as-you-go program. That's traditionally how the program has operated since the late 90s, to continue to address other needs and deficiencies in other parts of the county. So when the board adopted the program, essentially it adopted a project list that included 20 projects. At the time, the cost estimate was around $140 million, and the assumption was that the projects would be delivered over about a 10-year period. Next, please. So as I mentioned, the intent was that these bonded MSTIP funds would help cover the cost of these projects. We arrived at an arrangement. The cost sharing part of the program was the notion that the county would pay for about 2/3 of the project costs, and then other revenues would make up about 1/3 of the project costs. And those might be revenues from a city that were collected through their transportation development tax or system development charges in these new growth areas, or some other funding sources or combination of funding sources. That was based on some estimates about traffic and trip generation. So about 1/3 of the trips were estimated to be probably the result of or coming to and from those new growth areas. About 2/3 of the trips on most of these roads were assumed to be what we would call sort of background trips, people that would be going through that corridor regardless of whether the new development occurred or not. The program concept was reviewed and endorsed by the Washington County Coordinating Committee and then the WCCC's Transportation Advisory Committee prior to board adoption. And there's a bullet at the bottom of the slide here too, just to note that when the program was initially reviewed by the board prior to the actual adoption and by the WCCC, there was a longer list of projects than the 20 that made it into the final project. So the 20 projects that I mentioned earlier, we'll see a list here on the next slide, but those were intended to be constructed over a 10-year period. And then there was sort of a second tier of projects that was identified as being assumed in a year 11 plus or some other funding source would be needed to deliver those projects. So they were considered, but not actually adopted as a part of the program. And I'll come back to that briefly in another slide. So next slide, please. So this is a map showing the projects. And again, the high growth areas are indicated here. We had North Bethany and Bonnie Slope West in the northeast part of the county, urban unincorporated, South Hillsborough, South Cooper Mountain, the purple, and then River Terrace is the yellow area down in Tigard. Next slide, please. So this is the project list that was adopted by the board again in October 2015, and we've color-coded the rows in this to just give a sense of the status of our implementation of the program. So where you see blue rows, those are projects that are either completed or substantially complete. The excuse me, the sort of rose color lines indicate projects that are either in the design or permitting stage. And then we have one project, the green project on Roy Rogers Road in the River Terrace area that's currently under construction. And you'll notice near the bottom of the list, there's a 229th Avenue at Butternut Creek bridge replacement that's identified, and that's the subject of our proposed amendment today, so it's highlighted on this slide as well. Any questions this far? Okay, next slide, please. So since the program was adopted in 2015, we have not had the need to come back and amend the project list. But we do have a unique opportunity at this point as development has continued in the South Hillsborough area. We've identified an opportunity to amend the project list, and the essence of the proposal would be to swap out one bridge project for another bridge project. And at this point, we're not anticipating the need for any further amendments to the project list in terms of the actual project proposals. Next slide. So the proposal would be, and on the map here, actually, let me make a couple of quick comments on the map. So this is a map of the South Hillsborough development area specifically. So you have Tualatin Valley Highway up near the top of the slide. The green line near the bottom is Rosedale Road. The green line sort of on the western boundary, adjacent to the blue, that's 229th Avenue, or Century Boulevard, as it will eventually be renamed. And then the color coding, the blue area to the west is an urban reserve area. The green area, sort of at the southwest or the lower left, is an rural reserve. And then there's I think the intent was a tan color near the bottom of the slide, which is an undesignated area. So it's neither urban reserve or rural reserve. However, it is currently rural. So the proposal would be to essentially remove the 229th or Century Boulevard Bridge from the current project list and replace it with a Cornelius Pass Road Bridge project. Both projects are on Butternut Creek. And what we are proposing, our current cost estimate to actually reconstruct the Century Boulevard Bridge is about just shy of $8.1 million. Our proposal would be to commit the same amount of funding towards the construction of the Cornelius Pass Road Bridge. And I'll come back and talk a little bit more about project costs there as we move through the presentation. So this is a proposed public-private partnership to construct the Cornelius Pass Road Bridge, and it would allow us to leverage significant private funding for the construction of the Cornelius Pass Road Bridge. So again, the intent here would be not to commit either the county or the city, the two primary funding partners, to any additional public expenditure, but to leverage some private funding. The Cornelius Pass Road project, or Cornelius Pass, I should say, is a major arterial roadway and is important to the regional system. 229th or Century is actually a collector, so it's kind of a second tier roadway in terms of its relative importance in the countywide transportation system. And I would note that if we were to move forward with this proposal, the Century Boulevard Bridge would remain an unfunded obligation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go to. Any questions at this point? Thank you. Okay, so a little bit of information about the 229th Avenue or Century Boulevard Bridge. It is as I mentioned, a collector roadway. Long-term, Century Boulevard would become a City of Hillsborough roadway as the areas adjacent to it annex and develop. It does have an existing 2-lane bridge that you can see in the photo there. It's a timber structure, and currently the road itself is unimproved. It remains essentially a consistent sort of 2-lane rural section through this vicinity at this time. The bridge replacement that was originally envisioned in the adopted project list would have replaced this bridge with a 3-lane bridge with bicycle and pedestrian facilities. The original estimate that was in the list that was adopted was about $5.3 million based on more recent cost estimates after 6 years or so of cost increases and a little bit more work on the actual scope of the replacement for this bridge. The updated cost estimate, as I mentioned, is closer to $8.1 million. After the board adopted the projects, the program and the project list for the high growth or the bonding cost sharing program back in June of 2015, we actually had a need to make some emergency repairs to the timber bridge here in December 2015. So we did that and actually made the bridge substantially better than it was previously. And in addition, there is some additional remedial maintenance that could be done to the bridge that would help extend its serviceable life up to an additional 15 years if needed. And I don't think the intent is to have that bridge remain in place for 15 years, but we believe that the theoretical life expectancy of that bridge could be extended up to 15 years. And there are no bicycle and pedestrian accommodations outside the vehicle lanes here. And so there is a possibility that if needed and development were to start occurring north and south of this as a part of the South Hillsborough development, an interim measure could be implemented to add some bicycle and pedestrian connectivity with a freestanding bridge, or potentially a pedestrian and bicycle structure added to the existing bridge. Any questions at this point? Okay, next slide. So a little bit about the Cornelius Pass Bridge proposal. So as I mentioned, Cornelius Pass is an arterial roadway. The county will retain long-term jurisdiction of Cornelius Pass because of its higher importance in the countywide transportation system. The requirement here would be to construct a 5-vehicle lane bridge, also with bicycle and pedestrian facilities. The estimated total cost of the bridge replacement here is about $13 million. As I mentioned earlier, the intent of this proposal would be to have a combined city and county contribution capped at the roughly $8.1 million that we would otherwise expend to improve the Century or 229th Bridge, and just apply those funds toward completing the Cornelius Pass Bridge. As I mentioned earlier, that would leverage some additional private funding for the completion of the project, and that would include some engineering and design work, permitting, right-of-way acquisition, and then the private partners would fund construction and administrative costs over the $8.1 million public contribution.
Stephen, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
And I'm sorry I didn't think to ask this during a prior briefing. I'm really curious as to why, when we're putting in bridges, are we considering a 5th lane or a 3rd lane, which we usually reserve for turn lanes on roads like this that have a lot of different entries, you know, turning of vehicles and needing that refuge lane for left turners. Because it is a fixed structure. We have additional pervious pavement, stormwater implications, and you know, it's just as easy to have the largest lane width and only have 4 lanes of that, plus the bike lanes and the sidewalks. I mean, if an emergency vehicle comes through, the people in the bicycle lane pull over just like cars are expected to pull over. So why go to that additional cost in putting together that middle lane, which is essentially not in use for so much of its life? It doesn't seem cost effective.
Yeah, that's a great question, Chair. And the reason that we need that 5th lane on this bridge is that there will be a need for a left turn lane for the intersection at Butternut Creek Parkway. So for southbound vehicles,
right.
they will need that left turn storage, and then there's some transitional distance that's needed in order to do that. So the net effect would be to have to construct the bridge at the full 5-lane width. It's an excellent question, though.
Thank you for pointing that out, because I was only paying attention to the north, not the south.
Yeah, and as I would say
Great,
that as a general rule, we will always look to build the narrowest structure that we can. And so we do have a number of 2-lane bridges where we can get away with that, or 4-lane if that's the opportunity. And I did want to just make a comment. I don't think we have it on the slide here, but consistent with what the city has and developers actually have been building as Cornelius Pass Road is sort of gradually being extended further south as development occurs in South Hillsborough. They are constructing it with cycle tracks using the city of Hillsborough's typical design standard for a raised cycle track. And that would continue through this section as well. Okay, next slide. So I think nothing new, I don't think, on this slide really. So we think that, again, this is an opportunity to facilitate a timely further southern extension of this arterial, which is mostly being funded, as I said, by development that's occurring in South Hillsborough. We believe that improving or extending Cornelius Pass helps improve north-south connectivity, sort of for the larger transportation system. This additional capacity improvement on Cornelius Pass should help delay the need for some capacity improvements that are expected in the future at TV Highway and 198th Avenue, and potentially delay the need to improve 209th Avenue to 5 lanes by providing that additional north-south capacity on the parallel Cornelius Pass. The bridge structure would accommodate a trail undercrossing along Butternut Creek. And then again, as I mentioned, it just leverages private funding. One of the things that would also be funded with this, obviously the developers are paying for the roadway to the north and the south of the bridge. The bridge is just sort of the gap that wouldn't be completed 100% by the development. And then the developers are also willing to fund those long-term sort of maintenance or upgrade repairs on the existing 229th bridge that would help ensure that it has a useful structural life going forward until we are able to put together a strategy for how it would be replaced. And I think to that point, I would say that certainly the county and the city and our development partners have been creative and deliberate in terms of trying to find good uses of our public funds and how to get the most effectiveness from the funding, if you will. So I think that future Century Boulevard Bridge replacement, we will develop a plan for how to get that work done in a timely fashion. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this would be a little bit different from our traditional public capital project. This would be a sort of public-private partnership strategy. So a little bit different, but we believe we have a good path forward for how that would work. As I mentioned, the developers would take the lead on designing, dedicating right-of-way, acquiring permits, but doing so with county and city oversight. The county would ultimately bid, inspect, and manage the construction of the bridge project. And then just a reminder, as I said earlier, this moving ahead with this proposal would defer the replacement of the 229th bridge replacement. Next slide. This is a concept project schedule, so we're sort of in the stage. It's not indicated on this slide, but the first step obviously is getting board consent to move forward with changing the project list. Assuming that we're successful there, we'll continue working to bring forward agreements with the city and the developer that would help facilitate this project. And then ultimately you can see construction scheduled for sometime sort of mid or spring of 2022 through 2023. Next slide. This proposal is being shared through some different venues. The Hillsborough Transportation Committee was briefed on this proposal a couple of times, most recently in November 2020. The Washington County Coordinating Committee, Transportation Advisory Committee was briefed on January 7th. The Washington County Coordinating Committee Policy Group was briefed as well on January 11th. And at that meeting, they did take a unanimous vote to support this proposal. The city of Hillsborough, and this, we just found out this morning that the tentative date for this open house will need to be pushed back a couple of weeks as they work through some virtual meeting logistics. But there will be a South Hillsborough update open house hosted by the city, and we're anticipating it may be toward the end of January, or actually I think it was February 11th now is our tentative date. And at that open house, amongst other updates, they plan to seek feedback on this proposal as well. And then of course, we're here today speaking with you about this proposal. Next slide. So if the board gives us the direction to proceed, then there will be some additional board actions that would be required. Staff would return with a resolution in order that would amend the adopted MSTIP bonding cost sharing program project list. And again, as we discussed, removing the 229th bridge and adding the Cornelius Pass Bridge updating the bridge project cost allocations as we discussed here in the presentation. There would also be some amendments to a county Hillsborough bonding cost sharing agreement, an intergovernmental agreement that would need to be brought forward. There are a couple of amendments that are in the works to those agreements, one of which is unrelated to this proposal, but would sort of reorient some of the scheduling that was in the initial agreements. We would update our project costs and payment schedules, and then obviously reflect this proposed amendment to the project list. And then there would be a subsequent agreement between the private partners, the developers, the city, and the county to implement the project delivery approach that we outlined earlier. Next slide. That is the end. And as I mentioned, I do have Joe on the line, and then Don Odermatt from the city of Hillsborough is available if needed too.
Commissioners, questions, comments?
The only comment
Commissioner
I would
Trees.
make is that the WCCC unanimously approved it. I don't think, Stephen, you said that, and
He did.
Hillsborough was a strong proponent, so I just add that. And by the way, Chair, you asked the same exact question that the city of Beaverton representative asked. Like mine.
Commissioner Treese.
I just want to say that I appreciate the creative and innovative approach here to working together and making sure that the development community has got skin in the game, and that everybody is working toward a positive end. So once again, Stephen, you and your department do a great job in bringing the different groups together to serve the communities where we need to. So thank you.
Thank you.
Any other commissioner questions or thoughts? Commissioner Fye.
Stephen, I was just I don't know if it's a question rather, but maybe it's sort of like clarifying comment. Is it safe to say that the removal is driven by time? Because in 2015, there was an urgency to fix 229 bridge, but right now South Hillsborough and that area is booming, and there's supposed to be 10,000 houses, and I hear 2,500 of them are already occupied. So there's a need to switch. Is that?
Yeah, that's really the intent behind this. That's an excellent observation. I think it is a timing and an opportunity, obviously, for Cornelius Pass, as you mentioned, with the repairs that were made to the 229th bridge. We've already extended its useful life somewhat, and so the urgency for its replacement has been pushed off somewhat.
And then, thank you. And then the future fix that needs to happen, the future improvement to 229 bridges, that will be a cost that's observed by the developers that are gonna get the $8 million to do the Butternut Creek Bridge.
No, I think the intent is that there will be some combination of developer funding with adjacent projects that happen, making contributions toward the bridge, but the bridge itself will likely need to continue to have a public funding component. So we would need to come back and identify public funding at some point for that bridge, and then hopefully in that process also secure some development funding for that as well.
Okay. And then now I have a question from there, just now that my curiosity is satisfied. How much is the $5 million that was allocated in 2015 has been spent? Do we know?
We've not expended any of that at this point.
Any of the emergency development improvement that happened? Okay.
No, that was, the repairs were funded from our road fund because it was an emergency need as opposed to a capital replacement project. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you. Don't have any more questions, Madam Chair.
Oh, I think you're muted, Chair.
Thanks. I'm starting to learn when Commissioner Rogers does this, it means I've probably got my double mute still on. Thank you. It's amazing what I'll have picked up in another 6 months' time. So Commissioner Willie and I each had the benefit of some detailed briefings in advance of today's work session. So I'll just make note of that and say that I really appreciate the work that the team has done. One thing that Mr. Yonkins mentioned to me, because I was asking about the funding of all the different projects, and they really did a good job of estimating things in advance of that proposal in 2015. And the sequencing of the projects really has gone very well. So I appreciate that effort from the team in managing all these different projects. So at this juncture, Stephen, you were looking for board approval, and based upon the lack of any stumping questions from commissioners, it looks like we're ready to move forward in an upcoming meeting with the resolution and order on this.
Excellent. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you. So we'll move on to another transportation related topic, complete street design update.
All right, thank you again. So on this one, I'm actually going to ask Aaron Wardell to walk us through a presentation. Aaron's our principal transportation planner. And we also have Stacy Shetler, who is our county engineer. So Aaron and Stacy are sort of co-leading this effort. And the purpose of it really is to evaluate our current county road standards and looking at it with an eye toward the notion of complete streets, or streets that help to serve all of the users of the roadway. And so with that, I will turn things over to Aaron.
Thank you, Stephen. Good afternoon, Chair Harrington and members of the Board of Commissioners. I am Aaron Wardell, Principal Transportation Planner. Next slide, please. Today, we're here to talk to you about our Complete Streets Design Update. This is a project that was authorized by our 2019-2020 Long Range Planning Work Program. We anticipated it to be a multi-year planning project. It's a coordinated effort across all of land use and transportation, which is why it is co-led by myself and Stacy Shetler, our county engineer. We were last before the board in August of 2019 when we were initiating the project to let you know about it and get some early input. And we're back today with some information about the standards that we'll be proposing in a couple of months. Next slide, please. The background of this project is that Washington County's transportation needs have evolved over time. Our communities are different today than they were. There's a desire for design standards that reflect different types of communities, different land uses, and a desire to consolidate and simplify some of the different guidances we have for design across various documents that we've produced over the years by consolidating all of that guidance into the adopted road design and construction standards document. Next slide, please. The objectives of this project were to develop design standards that implement transportation system plan policies to reflect our land use context, different road users and their specific needs, our evolving community expectations for what our roadways are and what they can be, to reflect multimodal throughput, and to have flexibility in terms of design speeds and lane widths depending on land use context. The focus of this particular project is on the arterial and collector functional classifications of roadways within the urban or urbanizing areas, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next slide, please. I want to start with a few definitions for this project before we get into it any deeper. The first is to define what are complete streets. Complete streets are roadways designed to provide safe and accessible travel for everyone. All types of travel are equitably supported: vehicles, pedestrians, bicycles, wheelchairs, and public transportation. When we were kicking off this project, we went through a lot of different names for what we were trying to accomplish, and we settled on complete streets because it really reflected the desire of our different communities to accommodate all users. The road design and construction standards are our technical engineering documentation that contains the design and construction requirements for all public road and bridge improvements under Washington County's jurisdiction. And the transportation system plan is the transportation element of the county's comprehensive plan. It contains our policies and long-range vision for our transportation system. Next slide. I'm not going to read all of these strategies, but I wanted to give you an idea of some of the previous policies that we have adopted into our transportation system plan. There's 4 specific strategies that establish the policy background for this work. The strategy 1.1.1 asks us to plan, engineer, and design and construct a transportation system that provides multimodal function. Strategy 1.1.4 asks us to separate travel modes and minimize conflicts between and within modes. Strategy 3.3.1 prioritizes enhanced complete street and boulevard designs, specifically within the Metro 2040 regional centers, town centers, station communities, and main streets. And strategy 6.1.6 asks us to consider all ages and travel options when we're planning, designing, and implementing our transportation improvements. So that's a little bit of the policy background that we were looking into when we initiated this project. Next slide. This is a timeline of our project. So throughout this work, we have done targeted stakeholder engagement. The important stakeholders for this project include our community members who use our roads, but it also includes our internal staff. The road design and construction standards are the basis of our engineering work, and so they're used across all of land use and transportation. It was really important for us to engage staff all across the department and get their buy-in to the work as well as their input. Our first phase of this project was a detailed evaluation and assessment of our current standards. We also looked at other jurisdictions to determine what were some possible options based on what has been successful elsewhere. We then looked into developing policy framework and process framework. And finally, we are looking into our updated road standards and bringing forward our proposed update. We're anticipating that we will bring this forward for adoption later this year, targeting probably May or June for that. And you can see the star on this timeline for that date. Next slide. Regarding community outreach, we started this project with 12 targeted stakeholder interviews representing different community views to help us frame up what the community needs were as a part of this work and help us define our project outcomes. Since then, we've maintained a project website with technical information. Most of our engagement has been internal from that point on with LUT staff. We did present to the Washington County Coordinating Committee, Technical Advisory Committee, and the Coordinating Committee because we really wanted to engage our other jurisdictional partners as well. Now that we've developed the proposed standards for our update, we're ready to do a little bit more engagement. And so we will be doing an online open house, which will be active for the month of February. We will also be available to do community group and committee presentations. We are scheduled to go back to the TAC and the coordinating committee in early February as well. Next slide. So now we're getting into the proposed updates and what we're hoping to accomplish with those. The first of the proposed updates is to include area types for the functional classifications of the roadways. So rather than just having a standard for arterial, we'll have a standard for arterial and then different standards for different area types within that. And the design details that will vary depending on the area type are the bicycle facility options, the sidewalk widths, design and target speeds for the facility, an on-street parking option, and lane widths. Next slide. We proposed 3 different area types. And the first is town centers, main streets, or station areas. These are reflected in Metro's 2040 growth concept. They are pedestrian-friendly areas with lots of commercial and residential activity. You would expect to see people accessing these areas in all different ways. People will be driving there, people will be riding their bikes there. You will see a lot of pedestrian traffic. You will also have freight deliveries. The proposed design updates for these areas include more protection for bicyclists and pedestrians, an on-street parking option, lower design target speeds, and narrower vehicle lanes and medians. Some specific examples of town centers and main streets. In this image, you're seeing Bethany Town Center. Other examples would be the Cedar Mill Town Center at Cornell and Murray, or the Aloha Town Center at 185th and TV Highway. Next slide. We also have a designation for other urban. So this is other areas within the urban growth boundary. There's a pretty wide mix of land uses within the other urban areas. It's a wide variety. You can have everything from low density residential to strip commercial, large industrial users, campus type developments like Nike. We have a lot of different users in these areas as well. And so the proposed design updates would include more protection for bicyclists and pedestrians, on-street parking options for collector facilities, lower design target speeds, and narrower vehicle lanes and medians. And finally, we have our rural area types. So our rural areas are farm and forest lands. There are small commercial areas and large residential lots. In this area, we're seeing Shoals Ferry Road and Shoals Sherwood Road, which has a small commercial area and some residential uses as well as farm uses. There are a lot of different users in our rural areas. We have cars, freight vehicles, slow-moving farm equipment, and a lot of bicyclists. Our state planning laws limit the amount of improvements we can make in the rural area. We have no proposed updates at this time to our existing standards, given those limitations and what we can do. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit about our existing cross-section. I know this might be a little bit difficult to read, so I have some bullet points here that summarize some of the high-level pieces that we were looking at as a part of this work. The first is that this is our arterial road section. There's no differentiation by area type, really. It's just, this is an arterial. This is what we expect to be built in Washington County. Any differentiation from this cross-section needs to go through an approval from our county engineer, known as the design exception process. Our basic design speed for an arterial is 45 miles an hour. We ask for a 6-foot bike lane with no protective treatments, a 5-foot sidewalk. We have 12-foot vehicle lanes and a 14-foot median, and we do not allow on-street parking. Now, there are cases, you can probably think of recent projects where we've built something different on an arterial. And I want to emphasize that that's possible to do, but it does have to go through that design exception process. And we're not really giving certainty in the standard of anything we'd like to see other than what's in the drawing. So this is showing our proposed standard update for an arterial that is within a town center, a main street, or a station area. And this is showing two different cross sections because one of them is a 5-lane facility with no on-street parking, and the other is an option for a 3-lane facility that includes on-street parking. Would have a design target speed of 30 miles an hour, again, reflecting the multiple different users that you'd expect to see in a town center area. We would have a minimum of a 6.5-foot buffered bike lane. A buffered bike lane is what you see in the image, which is the on-street striped painted buffer. It would have an 8-foot sidewalk, as well as a buffer zone for landscaping, light poles, mailboxes, street furniture, elements like that. We would have 11-foot vehicle lanes, which is smaller than our current standard, and a 13-foot median, as well as an option for on-street parking, again, reflecting the different types of users you would see within the town center, main street, station areas. Next slide, please. Now, as opposed to that, this is our arterial cross-section in the other areas, and there are some little differences here. A 35-mile-an-hour design target speed, slightly higher than in the town centers, but lower than our current standard of 45 miles an hour. We would still have a minimum buffered 6.5-foot bike lane with optional green paint treatment. It's a smaller sidewalk, it's 6 feet as opposed to 8 feet in the town center areas. Still include the buffer zone. The 11-foot vehicle lane is the same as the town center size, but we do have a slightly wider 14-foot median reflecting the higher design speed. And on-street parking would not be allowed on an arterial in the other urban areas. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit more about protected bicycle facility options at this time. This slide is showing some different ways of providing a higher level of protection for bicyclists. While our proposed update at this time has a minimum of the 6.5-foot buffered bike lane, one way to 30% in a MISTEP funded project, we come before the Board of Commissioners and show you some different options for a higher level of protection for bicyclists on the facility. In order to do that, our project designers look at a number of different options. There isn't really an established standard for how we do a higher level of protection. And so this update gives us that opportunity to adopt into our standards what type of protection we'd like to see for bicyclists when the board chooses to have that higher level of protection. So this slide is showing 4
Is
different
everybody
alternatives.
frozen?
Am I frozen? Are we back?
Yeah, it froze up on me.
You
I'm
should,
also having a little bit of a difficulty through the whole presentation because your voice comes in and then fades out and in
I
and out. So
apologize.
I'm having a slightly challenging audio experience.
Am I still frozen?
No,
Is that any, okay. Are we back?
We're
Is the
back.
audio better?
It
Okay.
is better.
yes.
Okay, let's try this. I apologize. So talking about protected bicycle facilities, this slide is showing 4 different options, and we will actually have a couple more included in the online open house. And this would provide that standard option for our project designers so that they know what is the preferred treatment for higher level of protection. So in the top left, you're seeing a mountable curb separating the bike lane from the travel lanes. The upper right is showing a cycle track. So it's level with the sidewalk or maybe slightly different from the sidewalk, but it's separated from the travel lane by a curb and a landscaping strip. On the lower left, it's a median separator, and this median can be either paved or landscaped. And then the lower right is showing what would be our standard 6-foot buffered bike lane, but you can put in the flexible post, and that provides a visual and a physical note to drivers if they cross into the buffered bike lane. So these are some of the different options we're looking at. Yes, Chair Harrington?
Erin, I just, being a frequent cyclist myself, I'm not satisfied with just seeing a slide with these different pictures because their use has to be done contextually. Frequently on Veterans Drive, people are walking in the cycle track versus on the sidewalk for whatever reason. And then if you have any of the protected ones and you want to turn left into a driveway ahead, you can't do that. So the note on this does not indicate that usage has to be contextual in order to allow for that. There are very few runs here in Washington County where we don't have turns, and we don't have that many purely straight segments for these different examples. So it may work well in the ideal, but much of what we have in our urban area, because of the context, doesn't allow for much use of this.
And I think that's a really important point. Thanks for bringing that up. We'll be asking that question as a part of the online open house and showing these, it'll be 8 different treatments that we show and asking people for their feedback on how they actually work. We know that certainly driveways and intersections are challenging when it comes to bicycle protection. We are also intending to look at intersection-specific guidance for our design standards because we don't have that right now. So thinking about how you would transition a protected bike lane through an intersection is something we'd like to include as well.
So I'll say, as a community member who also contributed public comment in the active transportation plan, you're so kind of wearing us out in terms of having to tell you the same thing from one design document to another design document. So, but my key point was to make sure that you document that the design has to be done, the application of the design has to be done contextually.
Yes, and the fact that we've done this through multiple planning efforts is an important point as well, but we didn't go in and adopt those different plan elements into the road design and construction standards. So that's another reason why we're back now, is that we want to make sure that we have these standard drawings available and not in multiple plan efforts. So we will be thinking more about how to implement these going forward. Okay, next slide. So our next steps for this project, as I said, we will have our online open house active in February, and we'll be doing committee meetings and presentations over the next couple of months. We will also be developing our final proposed updates and graphics. What I've shown today is not all of what we'll be producing, so there will be quite a bit more. Our updates will also include some minor text updates and clarifications to the road design and construction standards that are of the nature of routine updates. And so that's something that we wanted to roll into this so that we have a nicely completed document altogether. And then expected board action in late spring to adopt this. There's also a longer term next step of this work, which is that I talked about the transportation system plan and how we have these really good policy strategies that we're now implementing into the road design and construction standards. But what we don't have in the transportation system plan is that guidance on where we would like to see the higher level of bicycle protection. And that gets a little bit to the questions that Chair Harrington was just asking as well, which is that these need to reflect context and they need to reflect places they should be built that make sense for them to be built. And so that's a longer term policy conversation for us to have in context of our transportation system plan, and something we can be doing over the next few years. Next slide. So our specific questions for today, and these are questions we'll be asking as a part of, first two are questions we'll be asking as part of our online open house, is do you agree with our selected area types? Do you agree that the proposed design updates will achieve project outcomes? And then specifically, while this online open house is active and over the next few months, are there groups we should be aware of that we should specifically be engaging with? And with that, that is our presentation for today. We're open for questions.
Okay, commissioners, who has questions or comments first? We got 3 great questions. Go ahead, Commissioner Treese.
Sorry, I was having a little muting issue. Thank you, Erin. Thank you for the presentation, and the complete streets concept, is obviously something that is really, it's important for our communities. Are we working with groups like, or are you considering working with groups like the biking to school? I'm not thinking of the
Safe
name.
routes to school.
Thank you. Safe routes to schools. And also the Getting There Together group that we heard a lot from in Get Moving 2020.
As a part of our stakeholder outreach, yes, and we'll be doing more of that. I can tell you the list of the groups who we engaged through our stakeholder outreach. We worked with the Tualatin Aging Task Force, our Get Moving 2020 local investment team representative, Beaverton School District, a large developer representative, Nike as a large employer, Baker Rock representing freight users, Central Cultural, the Washington County Committee for Community Involvement, Clean Water Services, TVF&R, the Street Trust, and then a representative of our Car Free or Car Light community.
Okay, so that's a very comprehensive list, and I appreciate that. The one comment I'd make is I believe you only mentioned one school district, which was Beaverton School District. Yeah. Is that right? Are there any thoughts to other school districts as well?
We certainly could, yes, approach the other school districts as well. We picked one for the purposes of these in-depth interviews because they all have school buses and we needed one to work with. And so it happened to be Beaverton, but we certainly should engage with our other districts as well.
Thank you.
Commissioner Willie.
It was awfully quiet. I didn't know if I was frozen or if you were frozen. I really don't have any questions. You know, I remember presentations previously where we were trying to decide what the design was going to be for the street. And I like the process we're going through on this. I would like it to be consistent depending on, you know, expectations of traffic and pedestrian and bike and all of those things, that we would be choosing a standard, I guess, for each one of those situations. And also, we have to take into consideration, as I look at these different variations that you gave, about how much right of way we have to acquire. And it doesn't, you don't give us, I guess I could do the math, I guess, since you got it out there at the side, but just total right of way that we'd have to acquire during this whole process, because that tends to be the most expensive part of it. Plus, of course, maintaining it for the next 30 or 40 years. But anyway, all of that, I like the way we go through this thing. I like the methodology. I especially like the list of organizations that you're going to be working with to get input. And so I like the process and look forward to you coming back and letting us know what you find out.
We were certainly cognizant of the issue with right-of-way, particularly as you're dedicating right-of-way to the enhanced bicycle and pedestrian facilities. We did make sure that these proposed cross sections would fit within our current right-of-way requirements. So we're not proposing any additional right-of-way necessary to do these, which is good.
And Chair, if I might add a quick comment. I think you've touched on, and I think Commissioner Willie's comment just touched on this notion about context, and it is very site specific in some ways. And so we have tools in our toolkit and our current road standards to be able to approve what we call exceptions to the road standards, to come up with unique designs that are responsive to context. One of the purposes of this toolkit update, or the standards update, is to sort of broaden the tools that are in the toolkit, but there would still continue to be a process in order to develop specific solutions for unique circumstances. And I think you've touched on this. We struggle a little bit with this notion about how to identify the right design for the very specific circumstances of a particular project. And we're currently making those decisions with board input on a somewhat project by project basis. And I think that's something that in the longer term, we would like to think about opportunities to think about those decisions in a more systemic way, but that's a fairly significant undertaking that will require some time and resources to do that. But we feel like this is a good step in the right direction, just in terms of broadening the tools that we have in our toolkit.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts. Commissioner Fye, did you have something you wanted to contribute?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I was just, reflecting back last time when, on-street parking options, or allocating a certain space for bicyclists on the main street, when that big boom was happening here in Oregon, or when that idea just arrived in Oregon. I remember that where we lived, where the main street became shared between bicyclists and cars, nobody checked with us. So I'm not sure, just thinking ahead, the equity process on this, like the town center and the main street or the station area, if there's a commercial or mixed use or with residents, to check in with that resident so that there is a buy-in and they give their inputs of, the design of the final proposal, if we were to, whichever options that we go with. So just reflecting back on that, just to check in with residents near or who really utilize that main street, so that they have a buy-in and that they give their feedback, and we check in with them and follow through on that. If they do suggest, on-street parking option is not feasible for one street, that we really listen to the residents and take their feedback meaningfully. I'm coming in on this conversation a little bit behind, so I'm not sure I have the suggestion on selected areas per se, but they seem pretty realistic, and also streets that I've used in places I've been to in Washington County. So look forward to the final project and the final design proposal so that we can have a conversation about inputs on final changes.
So Commissioner Fye, based upon what you're talking about, if we look back at slide 17 with the next steps, it sounds like what we're talking about is having an additional work session in there and not just going right to board action, but making sure that you and we have a better grounding in terms of what the proposal is now including after the public input and all these graphics are done. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Okay, if you could accommodate that project team.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And I think another thing that what Commissioner Fye was getting at was you have these design types, but then there's the application of the design type with different projects. And I think that's something that would be useful for us to hear about the next time around as well. And if you have some real world examples, great.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent suggestion. Yeah, we'll put together a couple of different circumstances that we can talk with you about.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would say to the application or the implementation element, we certainly do a fair amount of public outreach on our projects, and that includes obviously immediately adjacent owners, but the larger public as well, in terms of how we ultimately try to arrive at our ultimate built project type.
Commissioner Rogers, did you have something?
No, the only thing I would add is that I've seen the presentation before, and thanks to staff, I think has done a good job. But Stephen, you didn't talk too much about, and maybe Aaron, you can as well, the integration of these plans with the city plans. If at least all prior boards have said that as time goes on, there's going to be more urbanization, more annexations to cities, and we need to be very cognizant that our plans are integrating with their plans, because they may have a completely different functional use. They may have a different idea on connectivity. They may have a different idea on sidewalks, trail placement. I doubt that they are, but I know you've been excellent at making certain that they have a lot of input into the process. So far beyond this board's terms and far beyond any of us being there, can you talk about what you're doing with cities to make certain that it's fully understood what we're planning, what they're planning, and that they do indeed integrate with one another?
Yeah, Aaron, do you want to talk maybe just a little bit about coordination specifically on the update here? And then I may just make a kind of a more generic comment.
Sure. So we have been working with the County Coordinating Committee's Technical Advisory Committee as a part of this project, and we're going back to them in a couple of weeks to talk about this in a little bit more detail. Many of the cities are having these exact same conversations about what streets should be and what they should look like, particularly as they have these large capital projects going in. And so it's the right time to have that conversation with them so that we can be thinking along the same lines. I think that we are in broad terms. Commissioner Willie mentioned in the last presentation about Hillsborough's cycle track requirements, and that's something that they have already included in their standards. And so they're a little bit ahead of us in thinking about cycle tracks and where to require those. And so this is a conversation that's a good time to have. This standard does apply to roads under county jurisdiction, whether those roads are in a city or not. And so when we have a county road in a city, it is their land use. And when they're approving development projects, they have to come to us, and sometimes they need specific permits in order to access a county roadway. And so it's always a conversation about what is going to be built, what it looks like, what these areas are going to be as they grow up. So I think it's a call for continued coordination between us and the cities and making sure that their plans and our plans can work together.
Yeah, and I would just add very quickly, I think that was a great response from Aaron. And then obviously, as we get into the individual project development phase for our individual projects, that coordination with our city partners continues. And there's a lot of back and forth and give and take in terms of arriving at an ultimate design. And then eventually, because they are county facilities, the county ultimately gets the say in terms of what the final roadway design looks like, but we do work very hard to try to make sure that we have a product that both the cities and the county feel good about.
Okay, any other commissioner comments or questions? Okay, well, I have some to contribute. When on your first question, do you agree with the selected area types? Well, really my concern here is related to the somewhat of the segregated approach of some of the design types. And I want to make sure that the word integration is used because these facilities are integrated with our communities. And I think what you're really trying to get at is you are trying to get to it when you deal with the area types. What concerns me somewhat though is when the presentation then moves to the segmentation, it's very fixed, which leads to the later comment that Stephen made about how there are these exceptions. And what we do know is that our area will continue to evolve and get more urbanized because of the number of people who live in our community. And this region has made choices about how we want to preserve the adjacent farm, forest land, and natural areas that surround our community, our urban community. So I want to make sure that the design type approach is not just the segregated, but is integrated with the multiple design types. Now, I think by virtue of the experience that I've had with Stacy Shetler, with Aaron Wardell and others on the team, and that goes to Joe and others, I see that integration coming through. Now, by virtue of having a not too expansive set of slides, right, you had to make choices in what's presented. So I think it's there. And I appreciate that you're not telling me to go dive into thus and such document to find it. I really think that the team's intent is to bring these all in together. I just need to get that sense of together a little bit more. So that integration was one of my comments. My second comment is a little bit of it's a phrase that I just spoke a moment ago, and that is when I heard you, Stephen, talk about how we do have design types already, and I have a lot of experience over the year with the urban road maintenance design types or the urban road design guide. Like, that's why I feel a little bit sort of like worn out through this, because I've tried to participate over, actively over these last 20 years in my 30 years of living here. But particularly when you showed the road segmentation, and I didn't print those particular pages, sorry. I would like the exception, I would like to see a change from, yes, we can do that, but you have to go through an exception process. And instead, so here I saw the 11-foot vehicle lanes, and you talk about the 30 target speed. Those are good words. It was the other one where you talk about the 12-foot lanes and 45-mile-an-hour speed, or maybe I was wrong, but what I'm trying to get at is that there may be some areas where the lanes can narrow down because of the context, or the context of the speed. For some reason, I had 45 stuck in my head. So I'm really trying to push you, the team, to allow for, yeah, I think that's the slide that I was remembering. Yes, to allow for that flexibility downward in land use or acquisition and in speed, because gone are the days where things don't, where costs are really adding up, right? We know that the more land that we invest in and put into pervious surfaces, while it may be for very good reasons, for safety or whatnot, it's costing us on the surface water side. So 30 years ago, TVF&R would come in and say, no, we have these big trucks. They need to move swiftly so we can maintain our low cost of service response. Well, yeah, but you guys aren't paying the stormwater fees for these things. So we have to strike a better balance. I think you're really trying to work towards that. But I didn't get a strong sense of that here. And I'm really trying to advocate for that. So the other thing that has not been covered here today, but I know the team has seen it from me as an individual and open house comments, even most recently with an open house that's just kicking off on 178th and Farmington. And I think I contributed this when this topic was before us in last summer. I dislike channelized turn lanes, dislike them with a passion. And that's from a pedestrian standpoint. So this fits under the guise of, I think we have to be designing and implementing our travel designs so that it doesn't negatively impact the user that has the fewest resources. And that tends to be the pedestrian, right? We make the pedestrian wait for the walk signals multiple cycles sometimes, right? That pedestrian doesn't have the same speed variability that a vehicle driver has, whether it's an electric car, an electric service van, a big TriMet bus, fire engine, or a big truck, right? Those vehicle drivers have more tools at their disposal for getting to their destination more swiftly. So certainly one of the outcomes, I think, of this pandemic, or side effects, positive side effects, is we are seeing more people walking. Even in places with large cross sections in the intersections, many more people walking than previously. I think that's a good thing, and I think we want to ensure that as we continue to build out more of our urban community, that we're keeping people in mind. And it's as we have had the opportunity to learn from travel experts more about commerce. Certainly during my tenure as a Metro counselor, we had all kinds of different workshops with outside speakers. So really designing things for the person, the people, the experience of humans. And I realize that humans drive vehicles as well, but it's really at that pedestrian scale. After all, commerce is here for people. We have commerce because of people and customers. So that's my piece in all of this.
So Chair, I might chime in just for a second. I appreciate those comments. Hopefully you can hear me. And so I think the slide you're looking at right here for the existing cross section is what's in the current road standards. And so that was put up to contrast what the standard is now versus where we're headed. And so I think we're headed in the direction that you'd like us to see, with the smaller lane widths, shrinking things down to the context and scale. I think another point to be made is these road standards are used not only for capital project design, but also the development community. This is what gets conditioned onto developers. And so where we have a lot more flexibility in our own capital projects to go through iterations after design and the community and the context, our road standards really need to reflect what we're going to make the developer do. And so that's where the extra level of planning that Aaron was talking about is knowing what the street is going to be when it grows up, so that then we can build it exactly the way it should be built. And I just want to address the comments you made about right turn or channelized right turn lanes. And I know you're 185th at Walker. It's a slip lane. It's a bad design. And so I think we'll have opportunities to hopefully show you the pros and cons of some of the newer designs and how they can fit into that integrated system for all users.
Yeah, and I think we have a meeting coming up, Chair, sometime in the next few weeks, I think, to talk more specifically about that issue. And Aaron alluded to it earlier. We're also looking at some intersection design guidance that we don't currently have in our road standards. And so that's a sort of side effort, if you will, that kind of comes along with this effort, is trying to be a little bit more intentional in thinking about the design. And I appreciate your comment was spot on, that we are thinking about how we try to design these around the actual users, the pedestrians, cyclists, and drivers, but with a more intentional focus around the pedestrian experience and how cyclists navigate through, trying to help make sure that we make it safe and convenient for folks to do that. Yes. And
I just want to volunteer that I'm perfectly willing to accept a homework assignment. You know, I don't mind at all going on a road trip by myself, a field trip. You know, the mountable curbs over in St. John's, I actually had to go and stand on them during the week to fully internalize them. I mean, seeing it on a drawing and seeing it on the ground are very different. I remember participating in the high capacity transport system plan at Metro, and also for the TV highway study. I went and traveled multiple high capacity corridors in our region to get more familiar with challenges and opportunities. So feel free to give me a list of intersections to go visit, both in my car and on my feet. And I will go do that so that I can better internalize the direction that you're moving towards versus that intersection of Walker and 185th, where I would keep asking Andrew, why do you want to kill me? So I get it. Challenge accepted.
Excellent. Thank you.
Any other commissioner comments or questions? Well, I think you were pretty clear on next steps. And so I think just making sure that we have the opportunity of a good work session discussion before its adoption time will be great.
Excellent.
I really
Thank you.
appreciated this today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Keep up the good work. Okay, well, now I'm directed back towards the agenda. Hey, look at that. We're a little ahead of schedule. Credit to Stephen and his team for taking us through a lot of material quickly. At this juncture, we'll have a 15-minute break, a few minutes longer than that, and we will reconvene at 2:45 and pick up with our last two topics. Everybody all set with that? Any question, Commissioner Treese? Okay. All right. See you back here at 2:45. Thank you.
Welcome, Latricia.
Thank you, Clerk Moss.
Oh, you should have, oops. You could have just started without me.
Right, Madam Chair, the stream is ongoing, so back to you.
Great. Well, welcome back, everybody. Sorry I was late. I was goofing off. And so next we have the Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement Quarterly Report. Our first one ever. Welcome, Latricia.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, Chair Harrington, commissioners, and I want to extend a warm welcome to Commissioner Fye. It's nice to have other new people learning the county systems together. I am coming before you today to provide my initial quarterly report on the Office of Equity and Inclusion and Community Engagement. And I'm recognizing that we're just 1 month shy of the first anniversary of the Washington County Equity Resolution. So I'm coming, yes, thank you. I'm coming to provide some initial remarks to contextualize the moment that we're in now and to contextualize the work you are supporting. I'll talk a little bit about some terminology that has raised some eyebrows, and then I'll share about my orientation over the past 4 months, share some preliminary activities that we've accomplished, and then I'll pivot to forecasting important work coming in the first half of 2021. So let me start with context. Next slide, please. So I want to begin this presentation with a reminder both of the context for this conversation and a grounding in the urgency and the mandate for this work. This first quarterly report is happening auspiciously between the inauguration of our 46th President of the United States tomorrow, which is the pinnacle of our democratic process, and yesterday, the celebrations of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his wife, Coretta Scott King, and the contributions of the civil rights movement which have moved our nation closer to its democratic ideals. The civil rights movement was born of the desire to codify the full value of Black lives, which had not been seen as fully human, and then only 3/5 human for political purposes, and eventually as second-class citizens. And that movement has evolved as Black life continues to be viewed as expendable, and worse, as dangerous or criminal. As Dr. King said, 300 years of humiliation, abuse, and deprivation cannot be expected to find voice in a whisper. So Dr. King was very clear about the fierce urgency of now and the impact of state-sponsored violence that prevented Blacks from claiming their full human rights, our right to learn, to health, to vote, and to equal justice. The civil rights movement started almost 100 years after the end of the Civil War and the emancipation of enslaved people, broken promises for reparation, the largest execution of Native Americans from the Sioux tribe, the formation of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist organizations, and the emergence of Jim Crow laws of segregation that reestablished white dominance in government and social settings. The civil rights movement called attention to the horrors of lynchings, bombings, brutality, and segregation that had hampered Black life and health and prevented Black political, educational, social, and economic advancement, not just for the Black community, but also for communities of color across our country. This movement started well after white supremacist ideas were baked into our governmental policies and practices, and those of our government-funded institutions, such as housing, healthcare, our banks. Even after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, many in power sought to either slow implementation of civil rights laws or to roll back policies that promoted an end to poverty and oppression. And after the assassination of Dr. King, explicitly anti-Black policy became colorblind policy that maintained or expanded deep division in communities of color and communities with limited economic opportunity. I put the timeline on this slide because I want to point out at no time in the history of our great nation have we ever had the opportunity to heal from the horrors of slavery or Jim Crow segregation. We continue to see the depth of the disease of racism playing out in disproportionately poor outcomes in Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and many immigrant and refugee communities, just as we see protests still against racism and in support of the rights and humanity of Black and Brown individuals. I want to note, as leaders, we didn't create this dynamic, we inherited it, and we're responsible for ending it. And many leaders, including all of you on this board, have adopted a strong commitment to eradicating the inequities born of this fundamental aspect of our history. The strategies inherent in the resolution, the equity resolution, coupled with the full implementation of all applicable civil rights laws, are essential pillars of anti-racism, which requires us to abandon silence in the face of white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia, Islamophobia, and to actively root out racism wherever we find it. Throughout 2020 and in the first few days of 2021, we've seen incessant and undeniable evidence that an anti-racist stance is necessary in Washington County, our region, state, and nation, given over 400 years of history of de facto or de jure racism. Nothing short of a relentless commitment to anti-racism is needed in every professional discipline and community. As Dr. King said, we are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. There's no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action. So this moment in Washington County is not about demonizing people or professions, nor is it about the oppression and denial of anyone's humanity or right to exist. but it is absolutely about identifying, naming, and understanding more thoroughly the ways that racism has taken root in our systems, and then committing and recommitting to condemn and uproot it, which is the essence of being anti-racist, so that we can assure, as our equity resolution says, that all people we serve and our workforce participate fully in the region's economic vitality and have access to our county's services and other resources, and have the opportunity to reach all of our full potential. Next slide, please. So the resolution you adopted almost a year ago on February 25th, 2020, speaks to the importance of equity, diversity, and inclusion as essential strategies to dismantle racism in policy and practice, and to assure that we repair the damage racism and other forms of oppression have done and continue to do to Black, Indigenous, Latinx, other communities of color, as well as people with disabilities and those who identify as LGBTQ. As I've come into the organization, I've realized that we have some divergence in our language. So much of the organization's language focuses on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as I did some research, I found that multiple organizations order the terms differently. For me, I would just like to ask us to be intentional with our language and to begin with our desired outcome, which is equity. We want to work toward a community in which life outcomes are not predictable by race, color, national origin, language, ability, gender, sexual orientation. So equity for our community, the people we serve, and our employees who provide a full range of public service is our goal. Diversity and inclusion is a specific discipline that weaves together two strategies we use to assure that our workforce, boards and commissions, and other decision-making bodies both reflect the diversity of the communities we serve, but also assure that we engage that diversity to elevate new ideas, advance new approaches, provide higher quality service, and improve efficiency. It's essential, but it's not sufficient to focus our work on diversity and inclusion. So going forward, I refer to EDI, or equity, diversity, and inclusion, again, to assure that we lead with our desired outcome of equity. Next slide, please. So based on the equity resolution, I've focused my orientation over the past slightly more than 4 months on these priorities to determine what's currently in place from an organizational perspective. So very much honing in on what we're doing related to civil rights compliance, community engagement. I've heard a lot from a number of places across the organization about the importance of affinity groups, and also our data analysis and reporting. And Commissioner Fye, I want to apologize in advance for the ways that I so easily slip into using acronyms, even though I'm also new in the organization, and sometimes the acronyms are not helpful. Next slide. Preliminarily, I've done some work related to just assessing where we are related to equity as it relates to civil rights. And so that has meant looking at what are we doing related to Title VI and Title VII. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act focuses on client civil rights, and Title VII focuses on employee discrimination and harassment. What I found in this area is that we have a fairly low number of complaints. And I've looked over the past about 4 or 5 years. One of the questions I ask when I see that is, why do we have a low number of complaints? And I think that's still an open question. The question is it because that we're not actually experiencing, employees or clients aren't experiencing discrimination, harassment, or is it because they're unaware of the process, or is it because they don't trust the process? The other thing that I found is that we don't have a consolidated tracking system. So for example, I can't tell you without doing a significant amount of work, the number of complaints, the reason for those complaints, the findings, what actions were taken, how long it took to start an investigation, how long it took to resolve it. So that's something that's really important to me, is building in that data. We do have a Title VI plan, which I believe you all updated today in the consent agenda. And so now we're looking at who departments have identified for their Title VI point person. So there's been a lot of assessment, and I'll talk a little bit later about where we go from here. The other thing I want to note in terms of early activities, we did have our Native American Heritage Month celebration, which was the first honoring Native American and Indigenous peoples. And that followed on the success of the Hispanic Heritage Month, which was a great learning experience. And I just want to take this opportunity to mention that we're now supporting the preparations for the Black History Month celebration, and want to make sure that you all know that you're invited to participate in Black History Month events, including providing a statement of support. Several of you have done this and others are getting scheduled, but I just want to make sure that everybody knows that we'd love to engage you. Next slide. In terms of progress related to Title VI, the board, you all adopted our limited English assistance policy and procedure, and we'll be moving forward with implementation now of the LEAP procedure and plan. And we have now identified the limited English assistance plan and Title VI point people for departments. So we're getting moving with that. And then I've also been providing diversity support for some strategic recruitments, like the economic development manager, county attorney recruitment, which is still upcoming. And then obviously providing support as I can with the amazing work that's happening related to our COVID response, led by the good public health professionals in Health and Human Services. Next slide. So I want to just provide a little update on where we're at with the Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement team. One of the strengths of the resolution is the allocation of resources to build a team to ensure we have capacity to move the work forward. And I look forward to having more to share with you in the next quarterly update. But a lot of the initial months' work has focused on developing the positions based on whether or not similar classifications existed, and if not, developing positions that align with the work that's happened in other jurisdictions. Next slide. Next slide. So our office is staffing up to provide leadership in the following functional areas. Again, it just ties directly to what was in the equity resolution. So focusing on civil rights compliance, community engagement, diversity and inclusion policy, and data analysis. Next slide. So here we are with just a quick update. The 4 positions that you allocated to the Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement are all developed. They've now all been approved. 3 of the 4 are in active recruitment, and the 4th will go into recruitment now that you've approved it. And we just had the first round of interviews today for the equity data analyst. So that's chugging along, and I feel like the progress is happening as well as could be expected. I know that we wanted to have all positions starting in the beginning of the year, but I think that was very optimistic, and we're doing really good to keep that moving forward. And I just really appreciate all the support that I've gotten from the Rebecca and Nicole in Human Resources. So very much appreciate their support. Next slide. All right, so community engagement. It was really wonderful to come on and have a team that is highly skilled and very competent and committed. And I've had the pleasure of getting oriented to their work and having some opportunities to engage with them on some specific projects. Next slide. The first I want to highlight is your board engagement events. I know that in your roundtables, you've had discussions about these and how the participation in these events compares with other regular community engagement opportunities. So the next slide will provide some insights into how board events engage community in a different way than, for example, boards and commissions and community participation organizations. Next slide. So this slide shows the community participation organization attendance over the past 3 years. So blue is attendance in 18, orange attendance in 19, gray is attendance in 2020. So you can see, even though there has definitely been a COVID impact as we all made a transition from in-person meetings to hybrid meetings to now fully virtual meetings, but there's sort of a trend line of participation through the CPO meetings, and those tend to average about 15 attendees per meeting, with definitely some variation if there is going to be representation from one of the county commissioners or the chair, then attendance definitely goes up, but on average it's about 15 attendees per meeting. In the community investment conversations, which I was here for. I wasn't here for the earlier conversations that you had in May and August, but in the community investment conversations, we had about 240 people participate. And then because it is recorded on YouTube, there have been 380 views for that. And then in December with the COVID town hall, we had 68 people participate. A number were staff, and then 200 views on the YouTube channel. Some of the things that we did in terms of continuous improvement, which is exciting, is we were able to provide simultaneous interpretation in Spanish and ASL, and then built-in capacity to do closed captioning for the town hall, the COVID town hall on our YouTube channel. And these improvements align and help us live into our limited English assistance plan. Next slide. All right, there's also been a discussion, ongoing discussion in board meetings and work sessions about boards and commissions, particularly related to appointments and reappointments of members. And the following slides show how important the conversations about demographic data collection are. So next slide. So right now, we do not have demographic data for about 87% of the applicants and appointees to our boards and commissions. Again, apologize for the acronym. My understanding is that about 2 years ago, the county made a significant effort to collect demographic data from boards and commissions, and subsequent to that effort, there was a significant amount of data that was lost by our vendor. However, we can focus our energy on assuring we collect demographic data from new applicants and those asking to be reappointed. Next slide. So this data reflects the 13% of applicants or appointees that we have demographic data for in our system. So right now we do actually see gender parity. So about half and half, male, female. 11% of our board and commission members were born in the 1980s or later. So we definitely skew towards older members engaging on our boards. And then over 80, about 80% of our board members currently are white. So we are not in a position right now to say with confidence that we either are or aren't representative of the community, because there is so much missing demographic data. but we are in a position to implement some approaches. And I think you as the board can really encourage that collection or the provision, can't require it. You can encourage the provision of race, ethnicity, age, gender data, and other things that the board has been doing, like following term limits is important, and encouraging people to not serve on multiple boards so that there are multiple opportunities for diverse individuals to engage. Next slide. Okay, so I want to provide an update on the Civic Leaders Program. So just recently in September, we completed the 5th cohort of our Civic Leader Program. That was actually modified due to COVID to be more of a 2.0 civic leadership curriculum. 80 people have completed the Civic Leader training since we started in 2018. And of those 80 people, 14 people applied to be on a board or commission, and 12 of those were accepted. So that puts us at an 86% acceptance rate, although only 15% of civic leaders have applied to be on a board and commission. Typically, we had 20 people in each cohort, and a number of individuals who have gone through the Civic Leaders Program also serve on boards and commissions of other jurisdictions or in elected office elsewhere. So I just want to note the pathway to civic leadership isn't always straight, it's not always linear, and we are exploring how to coordinate with other jurisdictions' civic leadership training programs to create a more comprehensive look at the effectiveness of those trainings. Next slide. Okay, looking forward to, well, here we are in 2021. What can we expect? Next slide. So I want to just share about my timeline for how I'm hoping our recruitments will flow over the initial months of this year. So by the end of Q1 and Q2, or on our fiscal year, Q3 and Q4, I hope to be fully staffed and to be able to shift my focus to onboarding, orientation, and team building. I've shared with my HR partners that it feels a little bit like singing row, row, row your boat in a round, because every position that we're recruiting, we basically go through the same cycle and we'll do it 4 times. But I'm very encouraged by the quality and the diversity of the applicants and the initial 2 recruitments, and very excited to see what the following 2 bring. So this basically shows we led off with the equity data analyst. There was a position that we could basically model off of that, and that kind of gave a little bit of time to develop the supplier diversity coordinator position, the civil rights coordinator position, and the equity policy manager position. So the supplier diversity position is now in the SME review, the paper review. Equity data analyst is in the interview stage, and then we'll follow on with the civil rights and equity policy positions in February. And then we'll shift from this sort of rapid cycle of recruitment, interview, candidate selection into a more long-term onboarding, orientation, and team building. Next slide. Looking forward at community engagement, my approach will be to reorient the work of the team to be able to focus more intentionally on equity, diversity, and inclusion. And this means asking the team to reallocate their staff capacity. And so I'm trying to represent this here in the pyramid. We do have a significant need to improve the demographic data that informs how we're doing related to whether or not we're making our metrics and achieving the goals that we have been charged to related to diversity and how we engage the community. So making sure that we focus on that is essential. I'd like for our team to build out and develop more culturally specific relationships and networks. In the past, a lot of effort has been focused on civic leaders, which is really kind of a grassroots strategy to engage people who may be more activist or engaged in community organizing in different ways to engage in civic leadership. But we also have members of our business community who are people of color, and our legal community who are people of color, who also need to have the opportunity to engage, and we need to be in relationship with them as well. We've been listening to the conversations that the board's been having about how you all want to engage in community, and so we want to be able to provide that support for you in terms of board engagement activities, however that shapes up. We will continue to expand pathways for diverse civic leadership. We're getting ready to reissue the request for proposals for the civic leadership program and looking at some different ways to approach that. And then we'll spend more time, again, based on the data, we know how we're doing, the relationships we've engaged, our civic leaders, to do more tailored, culturally specific recruitments for the community participation organizations and for our boards and commissions. And then finally, providing support in a different way for boards and commissions, for CPOs, and for the liaisons to the various boards and commissions to support a welcoming environment. So really shifting from diversity to inclusion, making sure that our boards and commissions are welcoming, and that power and decision-making and opportunity to engage is also very welcoming. Next slide. Again, back to the equity resolution and centering on that, my efforts in the next quarter with new staff joining will focus on launching the 2 bodies that the resolution established. So the Equity Leadership Council was and the resolution was fairly clear about the membership based on positional leadership, which has limited racial diversity. So we're working on a structure that both recognizes equity leadership that may not be positional, as well as creating leadership opportunities through a coordinated committee structure. And this is I would like to launch this in February, and I can share more about the proposed structure offline. The Communities of Color Advisory Board is in an earlier state of development, but my early thoughts are to both rename this board and develop a charter that aligns with the racial equity work of our partners in other jurisdictions, and that explores a level of participation and authority that is more reflective of shared power with our community partners. The term that I've started using for this body is the Committee on Racial Equity. And again, that would also feed up, as well as other subcommittees, into the Equity Leadership Council. The strategic planning process has not begun. It will be essential to engage both the Equity Leadership Council and the Committee on Racial Equity in developing the strategic plan. But I think more importantly, it really needs to align with the work that Ms. Angie is doing related to a countywide strategic plan. And assuring that alignment is going to affect the timeline for completion. So part of my ask is to get your feedback on aligning the equity strategic plan timeline with the countywide strategic plan, so that we don't have 2 parallel plans and they're just integrated. Next slide. So I wanted to show a little bit about kind of the cadence of how the Equity Leadership Council would work, and how it would interact with committees and the Committee on Racial Equity, which is as you know, the community facing body. So launching the Equity Leadership Council would happen once the co-chair, who's a county commissioner, is determined. We know the other co-chair is our county administrator, Tanya Angie. But I'll need to work with our board representative as co-chair to start building out the agenda and the plan. The Equity Leadership Council, in my proposal, would meet quarterly, and then there would be committees that would meet monthly. And the committees would make reports and recommendations to the Equity Leadership Council through those quarterly meetings. And that will give committees time to actually do the work and give the council time to deliberate, engage community insight, and then adopt policy changes. So that's my proposal. The cadence can be adjusted once we see how that process works. Next slide. And this list represents an initial scope of work anticipated for the Equity Leadership Council involvement and prioritization. But in order to be responsive to the county's goals, it'll be subject to further modification as needed. So again, coming back to original priorities around Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, our limited English assistance plan, policy, procedure. I think both of those items will lead us right into revisiting the bilingual pay policy. And then in terms of diversity and inclusion best practices, I've heard from so many parts of the organization about the need for affinity groups. And so we need countywide policy that will support that moving forward. So I think those are very achievable objectives over the first part of the year. So next slide, I'll just close by reflecting back on Dr. King's statements about the fierce urgency of now. In his book, Why We Can't Wait, Dr. King said, human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God, and without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. We must use time creatively in the knowledge that the time is always ripe to do right. So I want to thank you for your support of equity and your efforts to keep equity at the forefront of our efforts and policies, and the urgency with which you continue to press for positive change. And I'll take any questions.
So commissioners, thank you, Latricia. Commissioners, questions or comments? I see Commissioner Willie first.
And so I'm going to break tradition already. Catherine, you know I don't like to go first.
I know, thank you.
Well, I had to get ahead of Commissioner Treese because I know she's always got great questions. So I wanted to try and get something in there first. Latricia, you commented about the number of applications we've got for these positions, and you're happy about that. I'm going to give you credit for that because we hired right in your position, and I think you bring a commitment and certainly a passion for this, and I think that word and certainly experience is getting out there. So I'm going to give you all the credit for those applications coming in like that. And I noticed that you responded to Dr. King's comment about fierce urgency is now, but I couldn't help but think back, he made that statement 30 years ago. I'd have to Google when he made that statement, but I think the fierce urgency has certainly is something that we need to embrace, and that's a great comment. You showed some demographics of our committees and that 80% were white. What I don't know what the percentage of white is in the county. Are we at 50%? What is our race demographics?
Yeah, I think we're somewhere closer to 60 or 70%. Let me get that for you so I don't misspeak. But I know that we are definitely underrepresented on our boards and commissions in pretty much every community.
Yeah, I would.
High race ethnicity. Yeah. So let me get that for you.
Well, and of course, that's your data person that you want to hire will certainly provide us with a lot more deep information with that.
Yes.
As far as the timing of your hires, I certainly embrace your timeline that you've communicated there, but at the same time, putting this team together with a real strong foundation and structure is critical, because we can't have any hiccups along the way. And we certainly have other organizations that have done that. They've had to stop and rebuild, and we certainly don't want that. So I would encourage you to take your time and be methodical. We want you to get it done, but we want it done right. And I know you do too. So that's my only comment to that. So, so anyway, great presentation, and thanks for all your hard work on this. You're doing a great job.
Thank you so much. And I do want to share back some of that credit with the board, because people have been watching, and you all set the tone for how the county is committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And that it might not feel like that to you because you've got so much on your plate, but people were really watching with the equity resolution, and it set a tone, and people are looking forward to what Washington County is going to do next.
That's great.
So thank you.
Commissioner Treese.
Thank you, Chair. And so along that line of people are watching, first of all, I echo Commissioner Willey's comments. You're doing a great job. I really appreciate this quarterly update. It really brings the office into clarity for me and what the steps are. So I appreciate that. I attended by Zoom the discussion yesterday at the Muslim Educational Trust that was hosted by Wajid Said and featured Commissioner Scholl and other members from our faith communities. In his closing remarks, he called on Washington County and Multnomah County to establish an Office of Immigrants and Refugees. And I just bring that forward so that as we are looking at our committee structures, as we're looking at this whole, that we're taking into consideration what public comment is. I'm not suggesting that's something that we have to do, but I would like to make sure that we are considering what the requests of that community are. So I just wanted to bring that forward. And again, to say thank you. And I'm looking forward to changing my, first of all, to not use acronyms, but secondly, if I do use acronyms, to use them to refer to the effort as EDI, not DEI. So thank you.
Thank you.
For our other two commissioners, Commissioner Fye and Commissioner Rogers, any questions or comments?
I don't have any questions. This is really a great presentation, Latricia. Thank you. Feels like I joined the board at the right time. Perfect timing. So I appreciate it and look forward to how I can help and how I can participate. And I look forward to joining the Equity Leadership Committee.
No, I don't have. I think Jerry asked the questions. It was a good presentation. I just looked up the answer to your question, Jerry, about the demographics, and I don't believe them. I don't think they're right, but this from the U.S. Census, and they said white alone is 79.6. That does not sound at all reasonable to me, but that's what it says.
The American Community Survey statistics from 2019 was 72% white.
72.
Yeah, that's what Philip tracked down for me for the State of the County event. But this is the year, hopefully, where we'll get the 2020 census data, right?
Right, we should get the 2020 census data at some point, and we also know that there is consistently an undercount of people of color, and perhaps even more so this year, given all the additional politics around the implementation of the census, in addition to the impact of COVID. So I think for many data people, it's going to present some additional challenges. It'll be very interesting to see where they land.
Yep, but it's our best available source at the moment. Darn.
Right.
Okay, well, I would just add, first, thank you. Thank you for joining our team. Thank you for helping us on this journey as we move forward for a better and brighter world for each person here in Washington County. One of the items that you covered was the strategic plan, and you spoke to more aligning of that with the overall Washington County strategic plan. Well, unfortunately, we haven't had those conversations yet. We don't have a work plan for that. In a general scheme, I'm generally okay with delaying, but we need a replacement or something to fill that void. So I'm not saying thumbs up on that yet, right? We still need to have some articulation of where we're headed, how we're trying to get there. So whether you call it a placeholder, replacement, whatever, but we do need something.
Senator Harrington, can I just have Latricia maybe clarify the work plan intent to demonstrate the work that's happening? Latricia, can you just clarify that intersection of the strategic plan and your work plan?
Sure. Yeah, I think that I can provide to you a work plan. The Equity Leadership Council can develop also a work plan. To me, that there's a lot of unaddressed need that we need to get to first. So that might be less of a strategic plan than an operational plan. And I think that will keep us busy. It will paint a picture of where we're going in the short term, and then we can align with the strategic plan as we go forward.
Which leads to my third point, and hopefully my last point, with regard to the structure. So part of what we worked towards with the equity resolution was acknowledging our role and responsibility as board members. I'm not particularly nuts about the slide 21 looking forward structure, because as I heard your description, it sounded a lot like, well, as the Equity Leadership Council, which is staff-led, staff-embodied, they decide. And it's like, rub's wrong. The other thing that concerns me is the Committee on Racial Equity. And I'm fine with the name, right? Been there, done that with Metro. We spent a lot of time talking about a committee name, right? CORE, Committee on Racial Equity, right? Getting to the outcome. This will be Washington County CORE, okay. But the Committee on Racial Equity needs to be advisory to the Board of Commissioners. What this shows is it's advisory, a report to the Equity Leadership Council. So for me, that's too deep.
Okay.
I don't want to have everything filtered through staff with the Equity Leadership Council. I don't want to have everything just being through the lens of the CAO. So I'm a little outspoken on this. because I think it's important. We're the elected Board of Commissioners, right? We are the ones directly held accountable by the community members who we serve. And so this is feeling to me too buried.
Okay.
So I can certainly see how important this is. And I do want the agency to be more successful, but I don't want this to just be a staff exercise. To me, that feels like we're reverting back to the way things were before we had more engaged board members supportive of racial equity serving on this board.
Okay, I appreciate that feedback. And as I mentioned, that's the least formed in terms of the thinking. So it's perfect time for feedback and input and redirection. So I'll take that and follow up.
And the other thing that I see that you have indicated it here with regard to our workforce and workforce pipeline and supplier diversity, just adding my voice to how important it is for me as a board member, not only what policies we adopt, but how we put into practice our commitment to equity through our investment decisions, right?
Yes.
Often you and the community hear me talking about how the Board of Commissioners makes policy and investment decisions. So I appreciate seeing that involved or as part of this. So I think we're on a really great journey together.
I agree.
I'm pretty excited. Any other commissioner questions or comments at this point? As I bob around looking for any unmuted screens. Okay, well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
First one done. Good job. Very, very informative. Okay, now we'll move on to our last topic. We'll move on to the Clean Water Services Advisory Committee, SWAC, recruitment update with Mark Jockers. There he is.
Here I am. Thank you, Chair, members of the Commission. I'm your last topic for today, so I think I'll be pretty brief and straightforward. We wanted to alert you to the fact that we have 2 current openings on CWAC, on Clean Water Services Advisory Commission. One was created with the swearing in of Commissioner Fye, who served on our commission for 2 years and stepped down now that she's on our board of directors. So we want to go out and recruit for the District 1 representative. The other one is an ongoing opening that we have as an agricultural representative. 2 things I want to tell you. One is we are starting to get applications for the District 1 position already. Thank you very much, Mr. Fye. So I think you have spread the word well, and we will continue to work with you as well as other people in District 1 to get those applications in. And on the agricultural representative, we've been talking with the Tualatin Valley Irrigation District, who we have a very close relationship with, working relationship on, particularly on the Scoggins Dam project. And we are eager to try to get one of their board members to also join the commission. And one of their board members actually came to last week's advisory commission meeting to kind of observe. And then finally, for context, these commission seats are 4-year terms. So these positions we're recruiting for right now will step into those terms. But we have 4 positions that will be opening up this year, in September of this year. And that is the at-large representative, the District 2 representative, another agricultural representative, and then a builder developer representative too. So there'll be an opportunity for the board in September, October, most likely, to also fill those positions. We'll be back to you to talk to you about that in advance of that in August. But right now what we have on our plate is the District 1 and the agricultural representative. And our goal is to bring those candidates back to you for consideration in March. So I'd be happy to take any questions.
Commissioners, any questions? I know I have one. On the agriculture representative, does this need to be, in terms of the position, sure, it can be someone who owns farm property, or what I'm trying to make sure is that there's also room for someone who may be a steward worker of different agriculture types here in the county. I was just thinking about this yesterday as I was going by one of the blueberry farms here in Washington County that's along McKay Creek, and wondering if our CWAC agriculture appointments provide for either the managers of the crews and the operations that deal with the different crops, as well as someone who may be serving as a field manager at a community supportive agriculture or CSA farm here in Washington County. Does the definition of those positions allow for that flexibility?
Yes, very much so. The definitions of these positions are pretty broad. The issue is the people that are appointed need to work to try to represent the interests of that particular, now, not that that's a monolith, but there is that. And certainly, it's the board's prerogative too. We've typically, for the agricultural representatives, we've had a long relationship with the Soil and Water Conservation District, which is often one of their board members has also served with us, but it'll be an issue that we'll have to certainly address this year with 2 positions opening this year. But that's excellent input. Be happy to recruit there as well.
Any other commissioner questions or comments at this time? And when you talk about the representatives from districts and at large, is that actually a residential requirement, or is that just a board district?
It is a residential requirement. I know that you had a similar question that's related to the Planning Commission, but this is defined as someone who lives within that district.
Great. All righty. That's it for questions for me. Anyone else? Great. Think we're all set.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, folks, that brings us to 3:41 for the afternoon. Are there any last questions or comments from commissioners today? Seeing none, pa-boom, we get to call it a day. Great. Everyone have a terrific 3rd week here in January. Take care. Bye-bye.
Great evening, commissioners. Thank you again.
Bye, Kevin.